Scripture readings, Proverbs chapter 3, verses 1 through 6. My son, do not forget my teaching, but let your heart keep my commandments. For the length of days and years of life and peace they will add to you. Do not let kindness and truth leave you. Bind them around your neck, write them on your tablet of your heart. So you will find favor and good repute in the sight of God and man. Trust in the Lord with all your heart and do not lean on your own understanding. In all your ways acknowledge Him and He will make your path straight.
I think it's difficult sometimes, and for reasons that are real and true. I think providence is hard. Jeannie and I, we look into our past together, and there have been a number of times that we've spent time just thinking about where we've been, people we've known, the things we have experienced, different congregations that we have been a part of. When we do that, we always see that at each place, if we just take each congregation we've worked with, there have always been blessings that have come to our lives in those places, and sometimes very unique blessings to that place. In other words, may not have received what we got there from anywhere else. There's also times as we do this that we look and we see that we feel like with certain people or even certain situations within the congregations, we were there at just the right time. But there were opportunities for us, unique opportunities to help, to serve God's will, to help His church in some particular way. We asked the question this morning as we think about those kind of things. I think that if any of us have been in the church very long, we can probably all kind of go back and think of similar type things in our lives. Were these coincidences? Or are these God working in this world, working through us? The doctrine of providence should, as we think about it and we consider what the Scriptures say about it, should give us great security. It should give us an incredible peace of mind to know that God is active, that God is doing things in this world. There is the reality of God's providence that we have to acknowledge as children of God. We might take that word providence and make it provide dance. That it's how God provides. As we think about what He has done as He provides for His people. And I think where it exists and where it lies is between two mindsets that we have in our world. One of those mindsets is deism. And deism just simply carries this idea that God created everything, but really doesn't care. He kind of put it in motion and spun the earth out there and then said, I'm going to let you all go. Do what you want. And that He's fairly disinterested in what's going on in our lives. He doesn't really care about the small minutia of humans. And so some people kind of hold that idea. And if you hold that kind of idea, if that's where a person exists in regard to God and what He's doing in this world, why even pray? Because you pray to a God in that kind of mindset, right, that doesn't care. That really isn't all that interested in what's going on in your life, in what your difficulties are, in what you need or the church needs. And so it kind of removes the whole need for prayer at all. If we go to the other side of the spectrum, from deism, you go over to what we call fatalism. And that is the idea that God does everything. That you really aren't in control of anything, that God's already laid it out, He's already made the plan, and there is nothing that can be done. That everything's going to happen just this way because God has set these certain things out there, and there's nothing really for us to do, nothing that we do has any impact at all on the end and what's going to happen with us. And it's very much the idea that we see in the parable of maybe of the Good Samaritan in Luke chapter 10 and verse 31, when you see the Levite and the priest, and they walk along the road there, and there is that hurt man on the side of the road, and they go on the other side, right? Well, God will send somebody to help him. God will take care of it. He'll do everything. I don't have to do anything. I'll walk on the other side of the road, right? And so what it basically does is remove my need or my responsibility to do anything in this world from me. So we either have deism where God doesn't care, or fatalism where it doesn't really matter what we do. We have no impact. And yet I don't think either one of those fit into Scripture. God's providence will land in between those two things. Providence is the belief that God is shaping and molding events in this world to fulfill His purposes. And I think that's really kind of where we have to focus down. To fulfill His purposes. It's not always about me. We love to think that it is. But oftentimes there are far higher things that need to be accomplished in this world than just whatever I want or I desire in my life. You know, there are two aspects to providence. Sometimes, first of all, we are the object of God's providence, right? God is moving things in this world for us in some particular way, right? Preparing us maybe for things that He knows, because He knows all time, He knows all things. And so God in His providence may be moving things and bringing people into our lives that will help us in something that we don't even know is coming. So we could be the object of providence. Second aspect is that there are other times where we are the agents. We are the tools of God's providence. We are the people that are being moved into lives of people. We are the people that God is moving into place to help in a situation. And so, you know, we can be the recipients. We can also be the agents or the tools that God is using in His providence. And we need to understand that there's two aspects. And sometimes those are not necessarily mutually exclusive to each other. Sometimes it benefits both parties that are involved. The Bible affirms providence on many pages. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33, after Jesus talks about there on the Sermon on the Mount, about not worrying, not being anxious for the things that you're going to wear or the things that you're going to eat, that God takes care of the birds and He clothes the lilies of the field. And if He does that, you're more important than birds and you're more important than grass. He comes down and says that if we seek Him first, His righteousness, His kingdom, He says, and all these things will be added to you. How? Well, through God's providence. So we see it affirmed by Jesus in the Sermon on the Mount. Romans chapter 8, verse 28, a verse that many people know well. Sometimes it's a little overused or misused, probably. He says, we know that God causes all things to work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. I want you to know, Paul doesn't say in that particular text that everything's good or everything has a good, but God works with what is going on in our lives and will bring us to good. Well, there has to be something on God's part there. He's working in that. He's doing in that. Hebrews chapter 13, verses 5 through 6. The writer of Hebrews says, make sure that your character is free from the love of money, being content with what you have. For He Himself has said, I will never desert you, nor will I forsake you. So that we confidently say, the Lord is my helper. I will not be afraid. What will man do to me? So the writer of Hebrews makes it very clear, right? That I should have this mentality. I don't need to worry about, I don't need to be obsessed with having money or having things. I don't need to find my security there, right? I find my security in the reality that God doesn't forsake me. Because money, moth and rust corrupt, and thieves break in and steal. But the treasures of heaven, they can't. I'll never forsake you. I'll always be there for you. And if God is on my side, you can go back to Romans 8 and hit that point again, then who can be against me? With Him I'm more than a conqueror. I overwhelmingly conquer in this world. We can look at examples in the Scriptures. We can go back and we can see Joseph, right? We see God's providence in Joseph's life. As God maneuvers Joseph's life through a number of different scenarios to bring it to the point that He provides salvation to his father and brothers and their families. Maybe one of the most powerful books in regard to God's providence is the book of Esther. A book in which God is never mentioned directly. And yet it is a book filled with God maneuvering things for His will, for His purpose. At the beginning you think, man, Esther, she's the object of that providence, right? She's really getting the good side of this. She's become the queen of the most powerful nation in the world. And yet before it's all said and done, we see God taking all that He is doing in the book of Esther, and He brings it all the way around to where she is the salvation of her people from the very nation that she has become a queen over. When we look in Esther chapter 4 and verse 14, Esther has been asked by Mordecai to go and to speak to the king. But Esther understands that you can't just walk in. I know we think, well, she's the queen. Well, there are still rules about these kind of things. And you can't just walk in and see the king. If she walks in and he doesn't extend his scepter to her, she's killed. And so there's a danger. And Esther is kind of weighing the options in this situation that she now finds herself in. And her uncle Mordecai says this: "For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, and you and your house, your father's house, will perish. And who knows whether you have not attained royalty for such a time as this." Oh, Esther, God's going to take care of the situation. You can be a part of that or not, right? I mean, that's really what Mordecai is telling her. God will deal with this situation, and you can be the instrument, you can be the tool by which God accomplishes this, or He'll find someone else, but God will accomplish it. How do you know that God didn't bring you to this moment right here, right now, for this very thing? Years in the making. And He brought you to a point so that you could be this to your people. It's a powerful text. It's a powerful story of God's providence there. And even Mordecai, while he doesn't mention God specifically, it's clear who he's referring to. Who's going to bring it about. We look at Hebrews chapter 1 and verse 14, and it says, "Are they," talking about angels here, "are they not all ministering spirits sent out to render service for the sake of those who will inherit salvation?" Sent out by whom? By God. That God sends out His angels to render service to those that are His. So when we see this, when we see this rendering service, we're talking about providence. That the angels are doing things that God sends them out to do on your behalf and on my behalf as children of His. And we kind of get a glimpse of that just a little bit in the book of Daniel, right? Because Daniel has interactions with angels. And they even talk about, well, I had to come. I was engaged opposing the prince of Greece over here, but I came over to help you. So they're engaged in things that we don't understand because the Bible doesn't explain it all to us as far as what's going on in the spiritual realm. But they are engaged. And it is for your benefit as a child of God, and it is for my benefit as a child of God. And whether I understand the workings, I don't understand the full workings of my car. Right? I don't claim to be a mechanic. I just trust that when I turn the key and put it in gear, it goes, right? And I trust in that, and I go out and I get in there, and I don't fret over the fact that I don't understand exactly how everything in it works. And sometimes people fret because they don't understand everything in the way angels work or God's doing and how He's doing it behind the scene. And yet that's not important. It's just have faith that He does and that the angels are. And that it'll always be best for you in your life. God has given us the things that we need. He hasn't given us every single thing there is. Well, I want us to take, though, in as we think about providence, consider just a few facts that I think it behooves us to know and to understand about it. Number one, God's work in your life doesn't mean your life gets easier. You think Noah's life got easier when God got involved in it? Think spending all those years building that enormous boat, spending a year on that thing, pitched, in other words, tar inside and out, full of animals, smelly place, spending over a year on that. You think life got easier for Noah when God got involved? Yet Noah found grace in the eyes of God. And it led to a difficult time. If you study Ezekiel, folks, when I get a little bit discouraged about the difficulties of preaching at times, I kind of look at Ezekiel and I go, I think I'll stick to preaching because I have it a lot better than he had it. Ezekiel's ministry at the very beginning of his time as a prophet there in Babylon was hard. God asked him to do some incredibly difficult things, laying on his side, one side and the other, for all the disobedient years of the nation of Israel. And it equated to almost a year laying on one side or the other and eating small amounts of bread and drinking small amounts of water and cooking his bread over cow manure. I mean, he was a living parable, living message for God. And God keeps telling him, you go say, thus says the Lord, and then He won't let him talk. And the people get irritated because he won't talk, because God said you can't talk. And they tie him up. I mean, he had a very difficult time. So God worked through him, and yet it didn't make his life easier. We think about a teenage girl being told by an angel that you're about to be pregnant, even though you're a virgin. How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to deal with the way the community looks at you now? How are you going to deal with how your family... Are they going to believe when you say an angel came to me and told me that I was going to have a baby and I've never been with a man? Or is that going to sound like a story you made up to try to get out of trouble? Even later in Jesus' life, 30 years later, people are still talking about that. In John chapter 8, they say, well, at least we're not a child of fornication. So they seem to know something about Jesus' past and what people thought about Mary. Greatest choosing of all time, the choosing of the mother of Jesus. And you think she'd have an easy life. God would have made sure she had an easy life, but she probably didn't. It's probably made her a great deal more difficult. The Apostle Paul, all that he did, and folks, open your Bible to 2 Corinthians chapter 11 and you'll find out about how easy his life was. As he lists all the times he was beaten and stoned and mistreated. All because God used him in so many ways to accomplish His purposes. So we don't need to think that, well, if God's providence is out there, it's out there to make my life easier, because sometimes it's not. It's out there to accomplish His purposes, and I want to be a part of His purposes. And that's going to be hard. Because the world hates the righteous. Always has. Jesus says always will. You know, there is also, we need to understand and accept, as we talked about just a moment ago, there's a degree of uncertainty in the providence of God. You know, as I told you, Jeannie and I, we talk about things and we say, this could be, this could be, this could be. But I'm not ever going to stand there and be, dogmatic and say, this is absolutely God's hand in this, or this is God's hand in that, because, folks, I don't know what is God's hand and what is not. It's not that clear. It's not that easy to see. And there's a level of uncertainty. That's what our text in Proverbs chapter 3 and verse 5, trust in the Lord with all your heart. Do not lean on your own understanding, but acknowledge Him. I'm not going to lean on my understanding whether I can see it or whether I can understand it or whether I can put my finger on it and say, that's God right there, absolutely, without saying. Now, I know when I came up from the water of grave baptism, that's God. Right now, there are certain places where I can be certain. As far as some of these things that move our lives and God's workings and providence, they're a little harder to tell. We need to be careful that we don't just say things, well, that was God's hand. Well, it might not have been. We need to make certain about those things. If He says it is His hand, then it is His hand. But if it's just our own understanding or our own thought processes, we need to be careful and wise in how we deal with that. Let me give you an example. You go over to Philemon, verse 15. You would think that if there's anybody out there, right, that could identify God's providence, in other words, God's hand moving things in this world, you would think it'd be someone like the Apostle Paul, right? Someone that has spiritual gifts. And actually has the highest level of spiritual gifts, save Jesus Christ, has the highest level of spiritual gifts as an apostle. He has abilities given to him by God that only him and 13 other men have. And so you would think he would be the one, but listen to what he writes to Philemon. He says, he's talking about Onesimus, Philemon's servant, his slave that ran away. He says, for perhaps he was for this reason separated from you for a while, that you would have him back forever. Did you catch that? He didn't say God separated. God did this so that He could go away and meet me and become a Christian and come back to you. He didn't say that was the case. He said maybe it was, though. Kind of like Mordecai, right? Maybe you've been brought to this very moment to do this very thing. So even the Apostle Paul understood and even gave credence to the fact that it isn't always easy just to put our finger on it, but it certainly has some earmarks of it. The fact that he does run away from a Christian slave master, winds up with the Apostle Paul, becomes a Christian, and now Paul's sending him back to him, right? There's something that's, you can't hardly write that story easily. You feel like that's God's movement. But even Paul won't just out and out say it. He says, perhaps that's the case. So the same way, when Jeannie and I look back, perhaps some of those things they certainly have the earmarks of what God can do. God also proves those He uses. You think about Joseph, all that God did for him, he becomes the head of Egypt. I think that's kind of where we jump, and he saves his family. But the journey that God carried him on to get there was not an easy journey, was it? He kind of proved Joseph's faith. He became a slave. He's a slave in a household. He's faithful to God, and he's blessed in all that he does. And then he gets accused falsely of rape. And he goes to prison for something he didn't do. But the whole reason he was accused of rape is because he would not sin against God. See, he proved his faith in the process. And he goes to prison. He spends time there. And he does nothing but right and good. And finally he is elevated to that high position in Egypt and is able to save his family and the families of many other people as a result of the providence of God in his life. But his faith was proven as they moved along that way. Esther, her faith was proven because after Mordecai said what he said, she put her life on the line, right? She trusted that she could walk in there to King Xerxes and she could walk into that throne room and he would extend his scepter to her and that she might be able to save her people. So God tests the faith of the people that He uses. allows them to show the people that they are. And she became the instrument of salvation. James chapter 1 and verses 2 through 4, James writes, "Consider it all joy, my brethren, when you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing." You know, when we think about the uncertainty of providence, it brings us right into the land of faith, doesn't it? Because uncertainty is that which is unseen, and that's where faith dwells. That faith in that unseen work of God, I don't have to be able to identify. God didn't have to put a sign out there, right, and say, "This is my work." I don't have to see it to believe He's doing it. Because He said He will. He's promised to take care of me. That's all I need. And that faith is that unseen. It's that which enables us to have that endurance, to embrace the difficulty. Embrace the difficulties of being the servants of God with faith. And when you do that, you will endure because of the precious promises that have been given by God and accomplished by God in Scripture. And I'm willing to go through anything because I know what God has promised. I know He'll strengthen me. I know He'll be with me. I know He cares about me. And I don't have to see it every time. I don't have to have a miracle to believe that He takes care of me. I just simply need to know that that's what He said. I look back in my ministry. I remember first place I preached. And I had a gentleman there who, to put it lightly, was difficult. Difficult in class. Just tried everything in his power, it seemed, to be hard and mean in class even. And I remember going through those weeks, and Jeannie had not been a Christian too terribly long, about a year and a half at that particular point, and it kind of bothered her. You can say whatever you want about me; it doesn't bother me. I'm fairly unfazed by that stuff, but don't talk about her. I'm a little more fazed by that. The same way for her to see me endure kind of abuse during class was difficult. But I don't know that I would ever want to give that up. Sometimes we say, if I could go back and do it all again, would I want to do it differently? I'm not sure that I would, because I learned a lot dealing with that abusive situation in a class format. She learned a lot about how to be a preacher's wife and endure what sometimes she has to see me deal with. And so, there's a proving there, right, that I can be His servant, but I'm going to have to endure some things, and yet I'm blessed by those things because it enabled me to be a better Bible class teacher. I was at a place that even before I got there, they were 30 years into splitting. Half the congregation just couldn't stand the other half, and I didn't know that when I came. And it was tough. It was tough to stand in the pulpit and watch 40 people stand up in the auditorium during worship service and walk out the door. But I don't think I would trade those things. Because there's things I learned from that I've carried with me. I was at one place where within the eldership itself, 4 different views on marriage, divorce, and remarriage. Spent 2 years going over that day in and day out, literally in my office, at least every other day with one elder or the other. Before that, I thought I understood it. By the time I was done 2 years of arguing that day in and day out, I understood it much better. It was difficult, but I don't think I would trade it. So these things, sometimes as God uses us in His life, in our lives, and He uses us to accomplish His purposes, there are things that are hard. But as James says, we can be perfected in those things. We can be made better. by enduring those things and having faith in the God that works. Simple truth is, providence requires much of us. Matthew chapter 6 and verse 33, I mentioned to you that He said, I will give you all these things, but at the beginning of that He says, I want you, though, to seek Me first. I want you to seek My kingdom, the church, first. I want you to seek My righteousness, what's right, what's written in this book, first. Then, I will add all these things to you. But I still have to be first. You know, when we look at Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, where He says that He'll work all these things together for good, but I want you to note who He does that for. To those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. In other words, I have to be the person that loves Him and His purposes. And this is His purpose, the church. The work that the church does is God's purpose in this world. Taking the gospel to the lost out there is God's purpose. Those are the people that verse applies to. Not just anybody and everybody, or just somebody that says, I love God, but someone who loves Him and lives in His purposes. That's the kind of person that God can work with their life, because their life is open to Him and what He can do. That verse in Hebrews chapter 13 and verses 5 through 6, where He is my helper, will not forsake me or ever leave me. But just before that He says, do not trust in money. To trust in God. No, folks, that's a hard one. It's easy to quote that verse. It's easy to say that verse, but that's a hard one to live. Because we really think a lot of times that money is our peace and our security. And yet it's not. And it should never be. He says, when you don't have that kind of a problem in your mind, then you look to God. And He'll deliver. Why? Because He always has. Because He has promised He will. So this morning, are you seeking God first? Is He number one in your life? If your list of priorities was honest and true, would He be at the top? Or is something else there? It doesn't matter what else it is, it won't be enough, it won't be right if it is. Are you living for His purposes? I mean, when you get up in the morning, do you think about how you can serve God today? When you go to bed at night, do you think about whether you did or not? It's those things that make the difference. And it's those people that it says His angels minister to, and that He blesses in ways that He blesses no one else. This morning, God calls you to Him. There is 2,000 years of God's direct action and God's providential action in this book, leading to one place. And that's the cross of Golgotha. And Jesus Christ hanging on it. So that this morning you could be His. Don't waste it. And don't wait another day. If we can help you this morning and become a child of God, I hope and pray that you will let us. Why don't you come as we stand there?